world had been washed away, leaving only mud and memory. For Clara Mae Thompson, stranded in the skeletal remains of Willow Creek, hope was a currency she could no longer afford. Her promised life, the rancher husband, the fresh start, all drowned in a torrent of relentless rain. She was a ghost in a flooded graveyard, her last prayer sinking into the cold earth. But through the roar of the storm, another sound emerged, the steady, determined beat of horses' hooves. He was a phantom of a man, carved from the unforgiving granite of the mountains, a brutal scar mapping the plains of his face. He was Colt Harding, a ranger who had long since buried his badge, but never his burdens. Without a word, he lifted her from the mire, his touch a shock of life against her frozen skin. He didn't offer promises or platitudes. He offered something far rarer: survival. And as he hoisted her onto his great black stallion, turning them both towards the heart of the storm, Clara Mae knew this wasn't just a rescue. It was a reckoning. A collision of two solitary souls in a world washed clean, where a love as wild and untamed as the land itself was about to be forged in the crucible of disaster. Part 1. The Drowning of a Dream. The rain was a merciless god. For 3 days and 3 nights it had scourged the valley, transforming the single dusty street of Willow Creek into a churning, brown river. The very air was thick with the smell of wet earth and shattered pine. From the relative dryness of the depot's overhang, Clara Mae Thompson watched the world dissolve. Her hands, raw and white-knuckled, clutched a sodden wool shawl around shoulders that felt too frail to carry the weight of her predicament. 2 days. She had been here for 2 days, a prisoner of the storm and a forgotten promise. The train, a great iron beast panting steam, had arrived late, battling washed-out tracks and fallen trees. It had deposited her and her single mud-streaked trunk onto a platform already surrendering to the rising water, and then abandoned her to the tempest. The man she was meant to marry, a name on a piece of parchment, was a ghost. Grant Ellis. The letter had described him as a man of property, a rancher with a sturdy cabin past the South Creek and a future to share. But the South Creek had become a raging beast, a frothing, angry expanse that had swallowed the bridge, the road, and any semblance of a path. Clara Mae had tried. Armed with a foolish, city-bred optimism, she had followed what she thought was the trail, her too thin boots sinking into the muck, her dress hemmed with a thick layer of mud. She had navigated a landscape of ruin, split rail fences bobbing like driftwood, barrels and broken crates cartwheeling in the current. She had called his name until her throat was raw, the sound stolen by the wind. What she found was not a home, but a grave. The place where the Ellis cabin was supposed to stand was a scene of utter devastation. There was no structure, only a splintered foundation and a tangle of debris, cracked beams, a shattered rocking chair, and the pathetic uprooted corpses of trees, their roots clawing at the gray sky. It was the wreckage of a life that was meant to be hers, a future dismantled before it had even begun. The realization hit her not like a wave, but like the slow, cold certainty of drowning. She sank to her knees in the sucking mud, the icy water seeping through the fabric of her dress. The rain plastered her auburn hair to her scalp and cheeks, tracing cold paths down her neck. Her wedding gloves, a hopeful extravagance she had saved for, were now grotesque, mud-caked claws sinking into the earth. She had nothing left. The small savings she'd started with were gone, spent on the train ticket and a new dress now ruined. Her last proper meal was a distant memory, a piece of dry bread and cheese on the train. Hunger was a hollow ache in her belly, a constant, gnawing reminder of her absolute solitude. The people of Willow Creek, the few she had seen, were phantoms of their own, consumed by their own survival. They were shadows behind boarded-up windows, figures battling to secure their own roofs and livestock. A mail-order bride, a piece of human flotsam washed up on their shores, was a luxury of a problem they could not afford. She was invisible, a walking, breathing embodiment of loss in a town already choking on it. She bowed her head, a silent surrender. The roar of the water and the hiss of the rain were the only eulogy her dream would ever receive. This was it. The end of a journey that had started with a flicker of desperate hope in a crowded, grimy tenement in Boston. She had traded one form of misery for another, more profound one. Here, there were no crowds to get lost in, only an endless, unforgiving wilderness that had already passed its judgment on her. It was then that the sound cut through the deluge, a sound so out of place in the chaos that she had first dismissed it as a hallucination, a cruel trick of a mind starved of hope. Hoofbeats, not panicked or frantic, but heavy, rhythmic, and impossibly steady. Slowly, painfully, Clara May lifted her head, her vision blurred with rain and unshed tears. Through the gray curtain of the downpour, a figure emerged, riding out of the mist like an ancient specter. It was a man on a massive black horse, both so soaked and streaked with mud they seemed a single entity, a creature born of the storm itself. He was tall in the saddle, a long rifle strapped to his side, its wooden stock dark with rain. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that seemed carved from stone and sorrow. He stopped the horse a dozen feet from her, the animal shifting and blowing, its unease a stark contrast to the rider's absolute stillness. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his gaze an unreadable gray from beneath the brim of his hat. It was then she saw the scar, a ragged silvered line that cut a brutal path from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent grim slash. He was the landscape made flesh, harsh, damaged, and enduring. Hope, that treacherous emotion, flickered painfully in her chest. Are you Grant Ellis?" she asked, her voice a fragile, broken thing. The man's head moved once, a short, sharp shake. No. The single word was like a final nail in the coffin of her aspirations. The flicker of hope died, leaving only the cold ash of reality. "Then why are you here?" she whispered, the question not for him, but for the cruel fate that had sent him. He stared a moment longer, a long, unnerving moment, in which he seemed to be weighing her very soul. Then, in one fluid, economical motion, he dismounted. He moved through the mud and debris with a purpose that defied the chaos around them. He walked directly to her, his presence a wall against the wind, and without another word, he bent down and lifted her into his arms. She weighed nothing to him. The shock of it, the sheer, effortless strength, stole the breath from her lungs. He held her against a chest as hard as oak, her sodden dress and freezing skin a pathetic contrast to his solid warmth. He turned, his boots making sucking sounds in the mud, and began walking back towards his horse. "Because I buried a mother and her 2 little girls yesterday," he said, his voice a low, rough growl, quiet but clear beneath the storm's fury. "And you're not going to be the fourth." Part 2. The Silent Ranger's Shelter. He hoisted her onto the back of the great black stallion as if she were a child, her body protesting with a weakness that shamed her. She clung to the saddle horn, her fingers numb and clumsy, the cold having seeped deep into her bones. The horse was an island of stability in the churning world, its powerful muscles moving with a steady ground-eating gait. The man, this scarred stranger, mounted behind her. He didn't speak, didn't offer a name or an explanation. He simply became a presence at her back, a solid wall of muscle and soaked wool. One of his arms wrapped firmly around her waist, anchoring her to the saddle. The other gripped the reins with an unshakable, masterful control. The world became a blur of gray and brown, a watercolor painting left out in the rain. They moved through the skeletal remains of the forest, the horse navigating shallow currents and slick, treacherous mud with an intelligence that seemed to mirror its riders. Clara May was intensely, terrifyingly aware of the man behind her. His breath was warm against her ear, a stark contrast to the icy wind. The scent of him filled her senses, wet leather, wood smoke, horse, and something else, something uniquely masculine and unsettling. It was the scent of a man who lived on the edge of the world, far from the niceties of civilization. Her body, starved and exhausted, began to betray her. Shivers racked her frame, violent, and uncontrollable. Without a word, he unfastened the heavy, oilskin-lined coat he wore and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy, reeking of his scent, but it was a shield against the biting wind. The gesture was so devoid of ceremony, so purely practical. It was more intimate than any gentle word could have been. Tucked within its confines, pressed back against his hard form, a strange and unwelcome feeling began to surface through the fog of her misery. A profound sense of safety. She didn't know how long they rode. Time had lost its meaning, measured only in the rhythmic slosh of the horse's hooves and the steady beat of her own shivering heart. The landscape changed, the devastated floodplain giving way to rocky inclines and hills cloaked in mist. The horse climbed tirelessly, its hooves finding purchase on trails that were invisible to Clara May's eyes. Just as she felt she would lose consciousness, a dark shape materialized through the gloom. It was a shack, or a cabin, clinging to a high ridge like a limpet on a rock. It was made of rough-hewn timber and dark stone, with a tin roof that groaned a mournful song in the wind. It looked as solitary and scarred as the man who rode towards it. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney, a fragile beacon of life in the desolate expanse. He swung down from the horse first, his landing barely making a sound. He tethered the beast to a sturdy post and then turned to her. He reached up, his large, calloused hands spanning her waist, and lifted her down as if she were made of spun glass. The moment her feet touched the ground, her legs buckled. The earth tilted, and the world went dark at the edges. He caught her with an easy, practiced grace, holding her upright, his strength the only thing keeping her from collapsing into the mud. "You live here?" she managed to ask, her voice a faint rasp. He nodded once, that same curt, economical gesture. He guided her inside, his hand a firm impersonal pressure on her back. The interior was as stark and unyielding as the man himself. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone hearth where a low fire crackled. There was a simple cot against one wall, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, and a rifle leaning in the corner. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and a profound, lingering loneliness. It was a space built for solitude, not for company. He moved with a silent efficiency that was both mesmerizing and intimidating. He threw more logs onto the fire, the flames leaping up with a hungry roar. He filled a blackened kettle with water from a bucket and set it on the grate. He did all this without looking at her, as if she were just another piece of the storm he had brought inside. Clara May stood dripping by the door, a puddle forming at her feet, too afraid to move, to speak, to taint this Spartan sanctuary with her messy despair. The heat from the growing fire began to sting her frozen skin. A painful reawakening. "Sit," he said finally. His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. It wasn't a request. She obeyed, her knees trembling as she sank onto the edge of the cot. She pulled the heavy, damp coat tighter around herself, a borrowed shield. She watched him as he moved, his tall frame casting long dancing shadows on the rough plank walls. He was a man of few words and decisive actions, a creature of this harsh, unforgiving land. Who was he? What was he? "What is your name?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. He didn't answer right away. He was stirring the fire with a poker, his back to her. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the flames and the howling of the wind outside. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that she had overstepped some unspoken boundary. "Colt," he muttered, his back still turned. "Colt Harding." Clara May repeated it softly, testing the weight of it on her tongue. Colt Harding. It was a name that fit him, hard and unadorned. "Thank you, Mr. Harding. Don't thank me yet," he said, still not looking at her. He moved to a large, battered chest at the foot of the cot, knelt, and pulled out a thick, clean wool blanket. He laid it gently over her lap, his calloused fingers brushing her knee for a fleeting second. The touch was like a spark, a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time, he turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes piercing in the firelight. The scar on his face seemed to deepen in the flickering shadows. "You married?" he asked. the question blunt and unexpected. She shook her head, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. I was supposed to be. He never came. Colt's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, contempt perhaps, passed through his eyes. Then he's either dead or a coward, he stated flatly. Either way, you're better off. The starkness of his assessment was strangely comforting. He didn't offer pity, only a brutal, pragmatic truth. A choked sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped her lips. And you? She found herself asking, emboldened by his directness. Are you married? He paused, his gaze shifting from her face to the mesmerizing dance of the flames. The silence returned, but this time it was heavier, filled with a history she couldn't guess at. Not anymore, he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. The words hung in the small cabin, a testament to a loss as profound as her own. In that moment, watching this silent, scarred man who had pulled her from the mud for reasons she couldn't fathom, who offered shelter without question, and asked for nothing in return, Clara May realized something that terrified her to her very core. In a world where every foundation had been washed away, she was already beginning to trust him. And in the wild, untamed heat that radiated from him, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire, she felt the first stirrings of a dangerous, primal recognition. This was a man. A man in a way she had never known. Part 3. A Shelter from the Storm. By morning, the storm had broken. The relentless roar had softened to a mournful whisper, and a pale, watery light filtered through the cabin's single grimy window. Clara May woke slowly, cocooned in the thick wool blanket on the cot. For the first time in days, she wasn't cold. The fire in the hearth still smoldered, a testament to Colt's silent vigilance through the night. Her wet dress, a symbol of her drowned hopes, was now hanging from a line he had strung near the fire, steaming gently in the warmth. Her body ached, a deep, resonant pain from hunger and exhaustion. But the overriding sensation was one of profound, unfamiliar safety. Colt was sitting in a lone chair by the door, sharpening a long, wicked-looking knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound in the cabin. His face, etched with lines of hardship and shadowed by the morning gloom, was as unreadable as ever. He didn't look up when she stirred, but his movements paused for a fraction of a second. "There's coffee on the stove," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's strong and bitter, like most things worth having." She pushed herself upright, the muscles in her back and legs screaming in protest. A faint smile touched her lips. "I'll take bitter over drowned, Mr. Harding." "Colt," he corrected her, still not looking up. He rose, his movements economical and precise, poured a dark, steaming liquid from a blackened pot into a tin cup, and handed it to her. There was no ceremony, no pretense. As she took the cup, their fingers brushed. His hand was large and calloused, a map of hard labor and, she suspected, harder fights. The touch was brief, electric, and she saw him still his hand for a moment before withdrawing, as if he too had forgotten what the simple warmth of another human being felt like. The coffee was as he'd promised, brutally strong, scaldingly hot, and bitter enough to make her grimace. But it was life. It chased a lingering chill from her bones and cleared the fog from her mind. "Are you a ranger?" she asked, the badgeless authority he carried being too palpable to ignore. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the razor-sharp edge of his blade. "Used to be. Left after the ambush at River Gulch. Wasn't anyone left to fight for after that." His gaze flickered towards the window, as if he could see the ghosts of his past waiting in the mist-shrouded pines. "They call me when they're desperate. I don't ride for anyone else now." The unspoken pain in his statement resonated with her own. He was another survivor, a man haunted by what he'd lost. "Why help me?" she asked, the question that had tormented her through the night. "I wasn't a wanted poster. I was just a woman in the mud." His hand stilled. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes locking with hers across the small room. The intensity of his gaze was a physical force. "Because when you looked up at me," he said slowly, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "You didn't beg. You didn't cry. You just asked if I was the man you were supposed to marry." He held her gaze. "And I've never seen anyone look more alone." Clara May swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. Kindness without motive was a foreign language to her. In her world, men were either predators or patrons, and both came with a price. "This isn't your burden, Colt," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "You could have just left me there." "Yeah," he said, turning his attention back to the knife. "I could have. I've left people before. Buried enough regrets to know which ones rot the slowest." The raw honesty of his words silenced her. He wasn't a saint. He was a man who had made hard choices, a man who knew the weight of his own ghosts. He stood, slid the knife into the sheath on his belt, and walked to a small, rough-hewn cabinet. He pulled out a can of beans and a half-loaf of stale bread. "It's not much," he said, not apologetically, but as a statement of fact. "But it'll hold us until the water drops. Then you can decide where you want to go." Clara May looked around the small, stark cabin. It was barely a home for one man, let alone two. It was a fortress, a hermitage. Yet, the thought of leaving it, of leaving him, sent a spike of panic through her. Out there was the flood, the ruin, the crushing indifference of the world. In here, there was a fire, a blanket, and a silent, scarred man who had looked at her loneliness and seen something worth saving. "What if I have nowhere to go?" The words were out before she could stop them, a whisper of her deepest fear. Colt, who was prying the lid off the can with his knife, glanced at her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes softened for just a moment. "Then we'll figure it out," he said. He said it like a man who didn't believe in promises, but kept them anyway. She watched him as he cooked, his broad back to her. The firelight caught the silver in his dark hair and highlighted the web of old scars on his knuckles. He moved with a contained predatory grace, every action deliberate and purposeful. An intense primal heat began to build inside her, a feeling so potent and unfamiliar it frightened her. It was a raw, wild awareness of him as a man. His strength, his quiet competence, the deep well of sorrow he carried so silently. It was a dangerous cocktail of fear and fascination, of gratitude and a burgeoning, untamed desire. This tiny cabin, meant for one solitary man, now held two. The air was thick with unspoken histories and an electric, simmering tension. Fate, it seemed, hadn't just moved a piece on the board. It had kicked the whole table over. And in the wreckage, something new and wild was beginning to take root. Love wasn't supposed to feel like this, she thought. It wasn't supposed to feel like a storm gathering, a slow burn in the blood that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. But as she watched Colt Bennett, a man who was more myth than mortal, she knew that whatever this feeling was, it had already claimed her. Part 4. Ghosts of Willow Creek. 2 days later, the water had receded enough to reveal the bones of the world. Willow Creek was a graveyard. The flood had been a great muddy eraser, wiping away the flimsy etchings of human endeavor. What remained was a tangled skeleton of broken carts, shattered fences, and the bloated carcasses of livestock caught in the grasping limbs of uprooted trees. The stench of rot and river mud hung heavy in the air, a funereal incense. Colt insisted they go down. He didn't say why, but Clara May knew. It wasn't for her to find closure. It was for her to face the truth of her own survival. She needed to walk through the wreckage of the life she was supposed to have to truly accept the one she had been given. They walked in silence, her feet still tender in a pair of his old, oversized boots stuffed with rags. He matched her slow, hesitant pace with a quiet, unobtrusive patience. He was a shadow at her side, his presence a silent source of strength. As they passed the place where the depot had once stood, now just a twisted iron frame and a toppled sign, she stopped. She remembered standing there, clutching her letter, a girl full of naive hope. That girl was gone, drowned in the same flood that had taken the town. "I was supposed to start a life here," she said, her voice brittle, thin against the vast, desolate silence. "A fresh one." Instead, I buried a dream and wore a lie down to the bone. Colt didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He just stood there, a bulwark against the wind, one hand resting loosely on the hilt of the knife at his belt. His silence was a form of respect, an acknowledgement that her grief was hers to carry. "What happened to the women you buried?" she asked, needing to connect her loss to his. "You said there were 3. His gaze, which had been scanning the horizon, hardened. "A mother and 2 daughters," he said, his voice flat. "From the homestead downriver. Drowned trying to get to higher ground. The water took their wagon." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The image was stark and horrifying enough. "Did they have anyone left?" she whispered. "They do now," he said simply, his gaze flicking towards the high ridge where his cabin stood. "I carved them a place, up high, where the water won't touch them again." A lump formed in Clara May's throat. This man, who carried more ghosts than supplies, who spoke in grunts and half-sentences, had taken the time to bury strangers with reverence, to give them a final dignity the world had denied them. And now he walked beside her, carrying her, another stray soul, through the wreckage. It was as they were turning back towards the trail leading to his ridge that they heard the horses. Not one, but several. Their approach announced by the jingle of spurs and the creak of saddle leather. 5 men rode out from behind the shell of the blacksmith's shop. They were hard-looking men, their faces grimed with dust and suspicion. The man in the lead wore a tarnished badge pinned to his vest. Another, a man with a slick, unpleasant grin, looked them over with an assessing gaze that made Clara May's skin crawl. They reined in their horses, blocking the path. "Mornin', Ranger," the lead man called out, his eyes lingering on Clara May. "Heard you had company." The word Ranger was laced with a faint, mocking tone. Colt said nothing. He simply stopped, positioning himself slightly in front of Clara May Doy. His posture didn't change, but an aura of lethal stillness settled over him. "We're looking for a woman," the man with the badge continued, his gaze still fixed on her. "Mail-order bride, name of Graceland, supposed to marry Grant Ellis." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Colt's feet. "Thing is, Ellis is dead. Got himself gut-shot in a saloon brawl 2 counties over. Turns out the horse he rode in on wasn't his." Clara May's breath caught in her throat. Dead. A man she'd never met, a future that had never existed, was now definitively, violently gone. It was a strange, hollow feeling, not grief, but the final slamming door on a chapter she'd never even had a chance to read. "Word is," the slick one chimed in, his eyes roaming over her in a way that felt like a violation. "She never made it to the wedding. Just wandering around out here, a lost little lamb." He leaned forward in his saddle. "That you, Missy?" Clara May couldn't find her voice. She felt stripped bare, her story laid out for these vultures to pick over. But before she could even form a reply, Colt spoke. His voice was quiet, dangerously so. "She's not yours to find." The man with the badge raised an eyebrow. "Didn't say she was, but a woman with no papers, no husband, no claim. That makes her vulnerable. The town council might need to decide what's to be done with her." The threat was clear. She was property, a problem to be managed. Colt took a single, deliberate step forward. The air crackled with tension. "She's not vulnerable," he said, his voice hardening into something as unyielding as iron. "She's with me." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. The 5 men exchanged uneasy glances. The slick one's grin faltered. Colt hadn't raised his voice, hadn't touched the gun on his hip, but his declaration was an absolute, unbreachable wall. It was a claim. The man with the badge was the one to break the silence. He stared at Colt, his eyes narrowing. "You claiming her, Harding. I'm saying," Colt replied, his voice a low, deadly growl, "that you're going to turn your horses around and ride down this ridge, and you will never let her name leave your lips again." It was not a threat. It was a promise of violence so certain it was a foregone conclusion. The men knew it. They looked at Colt's scarred face, at the cold fire in his gray eyes, at the quiet fury humming beneath his calm exterior. And they understood. They were outmatched, not by force of arms, but by sheer, unadulterated will. Slowly, grudgingly, the leader nodded. He gathered his reins. "The storm will wash this all out eventually," he sneered, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. Memory, too. They turned their horses and rode away, their departure leaving a void in the air. Clara May finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her body was trembling, not from cold, but from the raw, protective power she had just witnessed. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her voice shaking. Colt didn't look at her. He was watching the riders disappear. "Yeah," he said, his voice still tight. "I did. Why?" He finally turned, his intense gaze meeting hers. A fire, fierce and possessive, burned in their depths. The wild, untamed thing she had felt in the cabin now had a name. It was not just desire. It was a savage, protective love. "Because you're not a secret to be whispered about," he said, his voice rough with an emotion that shook her to her core. "And I don't bury things I plan to keep breathing." The words hung in the air, heavier and more binding than any vow spoken in a church. This was his claim. A declaration made not to her, but to the world. She was his. In that moment, Clara May reached for his hand. It was an instinctive, unconscious gesture. His rough, calloused fingers closed around hers, his grip strong and sure. The world had found its way back to them, with all its ugliness and threat. But so had she. And Colt had never once left her side. As he led her back towards the sanctuary of the ridge, their hands clasped together, she knew she was no longer a survivor. She was home. Part 5. Forging a New Life. The days that followed were forged in a crucible of quiet intimacy and shared labor. The world outside the small patch of land on Colt's Ridge ceased to exist. There was no past, no future, only the demanding, grounding rhythm of the present. They were two people rebuilding a world, starting with the small universe of the cabin. Colt was a man who spoke with his hands. He didn't need to say he cared. He demonstrated it in the way he tacked new, supple leather soles onto her ruined boots, saving them from the scrap heap. He showed it in the way he spent an entire afternoon reinforcing the cabin's back steps after he noticed her stumble on an uneven plank. He chopped a mountain of firewood, enough for a month, never asking for thanks, only accepting the mug of hot coffee she brought him with a quiet, appreciative nod. Clara May, in turn, found her own language of care. She had been raised for a life of domesticity, a life that had been snatched away from her. But here, in this wild place, those skills found a new purpose. She scrubbed the small cabin from top to bottom, chasing away the lingering ghosts of loneliness and neglect. She found a stash of old feed sacks in the small, sturdy barn and, with a needle and thread from her own meager trunk, stitched them into curtains, bringing a soft, diffused light into the stark room. One afternoon, while Colt was out checking his trap lines, she found a patch of stubborn, resilient wildflowers blooming in a sheltered hollow. She gathered them, their vibrant purple and yellow a splash of defiant life against the muted landscape, and placed them in an old tin can on the windowsill. When Colt returned that evening, he stopped dead in the doorway. His eyes, so often shuttered and distant, swept over the room. He saw the curtains, the scrubbed floor, the impossible brightness of the flowers. His gaze finally settled on her, standing by the fire, a smudge of flour on her cheek from the biscuits she had made. "You made it look like someone belongs here," he said, his voice thick with an unreadable emotion. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Maybe someone finally does," she replied softly. The tension between them was no longer one of wary strangers. It had transformed into something deep, primal, and electric. A single glance across the small room could feel as charged as a lightning strike. A brush of hands as they passed each other was enough to send a jolt through her entire body. They were orbiting each other, two celestial bodies drawn together by a gravitational pull too powerful to resist. The nights were the most intense. With the world outside plunged into darkness and the wind whispering secrets through the pines, the cabin became an island, their entire universe. They would share a simple meal of stew or roasted rabbit, the silence between them comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. But beneath the comfort, the desires simmered, a low, constant heat. One night, as a ruthless, cold rain tapped against the tin roof, the air in the cabin grew thick and heavy. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that made the small space seem even more intimate. Clara May could feel his eyes on her, a gaze that was both possessive and achingly tender. "Do you ever think," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "that this place was waiting for someone?" "It was waiting for you," Colt said, his voice a low, certain rumble. He didn't hesitate. She blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You mean someone like me?" "No," he said, and he turned his body to face her fully. The simple movement a profound declaration. "I mean you, Clara May." Her name on his lips was a caress, a brand. A sweet, terrifying ache spread through her chest. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that, Colt," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't have to do anything with it," he replied. He rose from his chair and crossed the small space between them in 2 long strides. He knelt before her, so his face was level with hers. The raw power of him, so close and contained, was overwhelming. "Just stay," he said, his voice rough with passion. "Stay long enough to believe it." He reached out, his calloused thumb gently stroking the line of her jaw. His touch was fire, searing a path straight to her soul. She had never been touched with such reverence, such fierce tenderness. This wasn't the fumbling of boys, or the calculated touch of patrons. This was the touch of a man who saw her, all of her, the broken pieces and the resilient strength, and wanted it all. "You didn't ask for this either," she breathed, her own hand rising to touch the brutal scar on his face. He flinched almost imperceptibly at her touch, but didn't pull away. "Life gives what it gives," he growled, his gray eyes burning with an intensity that melted her resolve. "Sometimes it's a second chance wrapped in floodwater and fire." He leaned in, closing the small distance between them. His lips met hers, not with force, but with a deep, consuming hunger that she found herself matching with her own. The kiss was not gentle. It was a storm, a collision of 2 lonely, starving souls who had finally found sustenance. It was desperate and wild, a raw expression of all the unspoken words, the simmering tension, the terrifying hope that had grown between them. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in his thick, dark hair. He smelled of smoke and pine and the wild, clean scent of the mountains. He tasted of coffee and a desperate, beautiful sorrow. His strong arms wrapped around her, lifting her from the cot and into his lap as if she weighed nothing. He held her pressed against his hard chest, and she felt not consumed but completed. In the heart of the wilderness, in a cabin built for solitude, 2 broken people were putting each other back together. This love wasn't a gentle spring rain. It was a flash flood, a wildfire, a force of nature as untamed and powerful as the land that had birthed it. It was passionate. It was wild. And in its fierce, consuming heat, Clara May was finally, truly reborn. Part 6. The Promise of Spring. Spring arrived like a whispered apology from the heavens. It came not with a sudden burst, but with a slow, gentle unfurling. The iron grip of winter loosened, the snow retreating to the high peaks like a defeated army. The unforgiving gray of the landscape was gradually infused with color. The tender green of new leaves, the stubborn purple of crocuses pushing through the rocky soil, the brilliant yellow of wild daffodils along the creek bed. The river, once a raging, muddy torrent of destruction, now flowed calm and clear, its voice a gentle murmur instead of a furious roar. Clara May stood at the edge of the pasture they had fenced together, one hand resting on the gentle, protective curve of her belly. The new life within her shifted, a soft, fluttering kick that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated joy through her. It was a constant, miraculous reminder that time moved forward, that life renewed itself, that even in the quietest corners of the world, creation was at work. Behind her, the cabin stood proud. It was no longer a stark, lonely shack. It was a home. A wisp of smoke curled from its stone chimney. The windows shone clean, and the curtains she had made fluttered in the soft breeze. The new steps Colt had built were sturdy and welcoming. It wasn't large, it wasn't grand, but it was whole. It was theirs. She heard the familiar sound of his footsteps and turned, a smile blooming on her face. Colt emerged from the barn, brushing straw from his sleeves. The harsh lines on his face, once carved by loneliness and grief, had been softened by her presence, by her love. The scar was still there, a permanent reminder of the man he had been. But his eyes, when they looked at her, were filled with a light she had put there. Fence held through the thaw, he said, his voice a low, pleased rumble. He came to stand beside her, his large hand gently covering hers on her belly. Not bad for two people who had no business rebuilding anything. She leaned into his solid warmth, resting her head against his shoulder. "Speak for yourself," she teased. "I've been rebuilding since the day I stepped off that train." He grinned, a slow, genuine smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "That's true," he said, his gaze tender as he looked down at her. "You just didn't know this cabin was part of the plan." They walked back to the house together, his arm wrapped securely around her, their steps falling into a familiar, comfortable rhythm. The fire still crackled in the hearth, not out of necessity against the cold, but out of habit. It was the heartbeat of their home, as essential as the bread rising on the stove, the boots by the door, the love that filled every corner of the small room without needing to be announced. Later that afternoon, they laid the final stone at the edge of the small, flourishing garden they had tilled and planted together. It marked nothing official, no grave, no boundary line. It marked a memory. It was the spot where Colt had first found her, a sodden, hopeless heap in the mud. The place where he had knelt, without a word, and lifted her not just from the earth, but from the ruins of her life. "Should we name it?" she asked, her hand trailing over the smooth, sun-warmed surface of the stone. "The garden? The stone?" He tilted his head, considering it. "What would we call it?" She thought for a moment, her eyes meeting his. "The place I got back up." He nodded slowly, a profound understanding passing between them. "Good name." As dusk settled, painting the sky in hues of soft rose and deep violet, they sat on the porch steps, her hand wrapped in his. The child within her moved again, a strong, insistent kick this time. "Do you think I was meant to come here, Colt?" she asked, the old question of fate surfacing in the peaceful twilight. That it was all part of some grand design? "No," he said, his answer as honest and unadorned as the man himself. "I think you survived your way here. I think you fought, and you endured, and you walked through hell to get to this porch." He squeezed her hand. "That's stronger than fate, Clara May. That's will." She rested her head on his shoulder, a wave of love for this man, this stark, beautiful man, washing over her. "And you?" He was silent for a long moment, watching the first stars blink to life in the deepening sky. "I was just a man with an empty house," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "I didn't know how cold and quiet it was until you lit a fire I couldn't put out." The stars bore silent witness to a truth that no longer needed to be spoken. Theirs was not a gentle love story. It was a saga, born of floodwater and silence, of bruises and bone-deep fear. It was forged in the fire of a wild, untamed passion, and tempered by the quiet strength of shared survival. But now, here in the soft embrace of a mountain spring, there was peace. Not a perfect peace, not an easy one, but one that had been hard-earned, paid for in scars and tears. As the wind stirred the new leaves on the trees and their child kicked against her ribs, a promise of the future, Clara May knew one thing with absolute, unshakable certainty. The trail that had begun in grief had ended in grace. And this cabin, these arms, this life, this was home. In the unforgiving heart of the Wild West, stories are not always writ in smoke and blood. Sometimes they are whispered on the wind, carried in the current of a river, and built on a foundation of quiet courage. The tale of Clara May and Colt is a testament to the resilient, unyielding power of the human heart. It teaches us that home is not a place on a map, but a sanctuary we build in the soul of another. It reminds us that love, in its purest, most untamed form, is not found in gentle gardens, but often blooms most fiercely in the most broken of landscapes. It is a force of nature, a fire that can cauterize old wounds and forge a new future from the ashes of the past. True strength is not the absence of scars, but the courage to bear them, and the grace to let someone else help carry their weight. Thank you for joining us at Wild West Stories. If this tale of survival and savage love resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing it with others who appreciate that the most profound histories are often the ones that are never written down.